obisk. Jaz se sploh ne počutim kot tujec tudi v Ljubljani, ampak se sem udeležnik tisto mednarodnih dela, tisto simpozija in sicer sam napisal ta prispevek v angleščini in ga bom tudi prebral v angleščini, to skozi, jaz ne vem, 15 minut. Jaz ne morem to tak brez tistih predložkov. To ne bo problem. So, author is a critic. And I go straight to the footnote, mistra tu so dve vse skup. The text was conceived as an auxiliary first-hand sketch to list and address a couple of title-related topics and perspectives to be elaborated and discussed live in the course of the International Symposium, The Art of Criticism. So, author as a critic. The authors of literary texts, colloquially known as writers, are sometimes, in some literary fields, less seldom than in others, also the authors of more or less critical texts on the work of the fellow writers. The later role of theirs would colloquially be referred to as the one of a critic. But, assuming the observer being aware of such a dual role, the respective function of theirs will often be judged differently than in the case when the individual in question is exclusively a critic, unstained by publicly displayed literary aspirations. At the same time, and on the contrary, a literary work of an author critic will less often be scrutinized or judged on the account of his or her role as a critic, at least in theory. The matter, as well as the beef around it, is almost as old as the classical plain writer-critic conflict. Further on in the text, I'll be using an author instead of writer, denote recognized authors of literary text. Referring to it, I'm counting on the existence of a certain consensus within the literary field that acknowledges an individual as a literary author regardless of his or her role and function as a critic, and regardless the current distribution and dominant in the realm of the personal symbolical capital within the author-critic seesaw. The later dynamics is, of course, all but irrelevant, but also very complex and micro-context dependent, so it will be, for the sake of the broader image, temporarily set aside. The stereotypes are known, dull, and mostly off the point. Critic as a failed, jealous, unaccomplished author, and so forth, from the gossip sessions of the Victorian salons to the cover stories of the New Yorker magazine. Only in this case, when the subject is officially playing a dual role, they get to be a bit more elaborated. If the author-critic is not really successful as an author, he's in a good old manner, obviously taking a revenge on his better-off peers. In the case he's actually well accomplished, then it must be mainly about will to power, plotting against the colleagues, and securing the perimeter, so staying on top, or getting even higher over the dead bodies, savagely sketching the text, endangering his or her position. These stereotypes are by no means reduced to a specific culture, context, language, or a literary field. They could be observed almost as a sort of transcultural constants of oversimplified cracker barrel sociology of literature, which is by no means out of the domain of the literary professionals. This situation is, I believe, somewhat specific when applied to so-called small literatures, the literatures of the small languages, or much more precise, small literary fields, as described in the tradition of Pierre Bourdieu. As the small ones, I'll be denoting literary fields in the realm of which the actors and protagonists of the professional, and often also way less exclusive, going far under the professional level, sphere mostly know each other, are more or less informed about and acquainted with each other's works and its public perception, and often actually do know each other in person. I think we all know the situation. Most radically though, this should be displayed within a field predominantly framed by a specific small language, additionally amplified with the framework of an independent state and the array of its institutions. The dynamic of the different scenes, groups and milieus within the big national or supranational literary fields share a lot of similarities, but are different in flavor and scope. The so-called post-Yugoslav literary field or fields would make almost an ideal example. The field that was once to a certain extent unified in the vast scope of its features was, to non-political reasons, violently parceled, and huge top-down effort was applied to try to keep it apart. Skipping the all but irrelevant details, besides the unofficial, intradynamically and historically complex and institutionally unsupported and often directly or indirectly sabotaged universal post-Yugoslav literary field, we are now facing national literatures of 7 independent states, 4 of which being written in the same polycentric language of 4 different ethno-nationally derived names. All 7 fulfill all the conditions to be considered a small literary field, sometimes to almost ancestral level. The contextual, structural, and sheer economic conjuncture forces its protagonists, in order to survive as the professionals within the border of the field, to practice many different roles and professional identities simultaneously in different combinations. E.g., as authors, critics, publishers, translators, literature and language professors, editors, proofreaders, journalists, jury members, presenters and promoters, organizers of fairs and festivals, distributors, librarians, booksellers, members of the literature-bound boards, councils and regulatory bodies, all the way up to the highest level of the local or the state politics, etc. The number of the roles, functions and positions practiced by a single individual, as well as the number of individuals in the field practicing 4 or 5 or more roles simultaneously is in the given context immense. Not to be mentioning the personal relations, being friends, foes, partners in business and bets, relatives, spouses, structurally on or and economically mutually dependent, politically sided or fiercely opposed, and so on and so forth. It needs to be said that as a literary professional from the post-Jew area, I fully fit the depicted framework also myself. There's another contextual feature pointing post-Yugoslav authors to extensively practice literary criticism to the far larger extent than, for instance, their Anglophone peers. Besides the economic necessity and historical background, they very often received reasonably good formal education in theory and history of literature and or languages. A great percentage of active participants of the fields in question simply went through extensive studies of literature and holds corresponding degrees, PhDs, and so on. A random leafing through who is who of contemporary post-Jew literatures often feels like glancing through a yearbook of the alumni of the comparative literature, world literature, Serbian, Croatian, Slovenian, etc. language and literature departments. Since creative writing studies and MFAs in general are effectively non-existent on the academic level, the future authors turn to more technical studies, resulting in authors simply practicing their elaborated professional competences. Of course, on the work of their, as we see, usually very closely related peers. The latter, though, doesn't really explain the fact that in the referent literary fields there are practically no significant critics that are not authors themselves. No Michiko Kakutani, no Rajhraniki. The non-existence of such a figure, on the other hand, most probably does have something to do with the economically necessary multiple focuses of the practicing critics, as well as with the general mistrust in the very concept of the author as critic. Of course, from the side of that handful of authors who are not critics themselves. To be fully fair, it needs to be noted that the field or fields currently lack universally recognizable, symbolically strong and influential critical figures as such, regardless to their authorial status. Here I go to the footnote again. The last generation of younger critics to emerge, mostly late millennials and early zoomers, led predominantly by new female voices, seems to demonstrate high competence and critical conscience, while mostly refraining from literary aspirations. It is of course hard to predict how will their professional path look like, especially having basically all the features of the hard context, patriarchal background by no means to be neglected, against them. Back to the text. The reasons are to be looked for in the predictable mixture of economic, demographic and other contextual elements, e.g. decades-long decade of public media, sheer tabloidism of the privately owned yellow press, general shift in the status of well-being of the Gutenberg galaxy, paradigm change in the realm of information and knowledge structures, attention span, and so on. It seemed that the social constellation that was able to produce and maintain critics of such a status, figures as different as Igor Mandic on the one and Dusan Pirjevec on the other side of the spectrum, is now long gone. It was for reasons having little to do with literature or culture, intentionally crushed in course of Yugoslav wars and their transitional aftermath. Problems emerging out of the depicted constellation are harsh, rather obvious, and hard to address. Combined with the general and often justified lack of trust in the deliberately undermined institutions, the role of the media as a PR outlet, and in some of the referent fields, publishing seemed totally dependent and focused on the public funds and state budget, and at the same time forced to partially play or at least mimic the basically unsustainable open market conditions. They result in toxic, clown-channelized mess on all levels. There's a trust in independent critical figures in generally is hard to conceive. In case the critic himself is also an author, we're on the verge of every sentence published being read as a proclamation of war, on various enemies, of course. The enemies, as Oscar Wilde famously noticed, hidden in the eye of the reader. Such a conditions are, I'm fully aware, almost impossible to fight or reverse out of the much wider context, necessarily involving serious changes on the level of the entire society and economic base. So what can we, the lost species of tired author critics with the stigma of the sheer social Darwinism, do to try to regain the trust? Of course, without leaving our central heated apartments, built in the time of the socialist Yugoslavia, staying rooted well within the pleasant realm of the text, clutching up a cup of homebrewed tea and wrapped in our grandma's blankets. The insulting banality being the charge, hereby I can offer no more than equally banal truism as an answer. It's to do your job or jobs fairly. Of course, I mean brutally, radically fairly toward yourself and the others. No better way to joyfully destroy your career and live happily ever after. Thank you.